Okay, hopefully this one shouldn't be as contentious. Name I settled on is Quickpoints, Right-Wing Brainwashing. Don't like the name, I'm going to explain why right away. There are a handful of terms that kind of mean the same thing. There's brainwashing and radicalization, which more or less mean the same thing, and they're both forms of conversion. Conversion, in a general sense, is really easy. It means you used to believe one thing, and over a long period of time you came to believe another thing. It's just something that... It's a quirk of psychiatry. It's kind of like the mere exposure effect, if anyone's familiar with that. If you become familiar with something, you just kind of like it more. All of these things generally mean the same thing, in a broad sense. Like, you could say the difference between something like brainwashing and something like radicalization is, radicalization generally means that a person has been converted to an unconventional political or religious viewpoint. Usually a viewpoint opposed to the established order. Like, in the strictest sense, I've been radicalized into the far left. Brainwashing, on the other hand, is something that's active on the part of the brainwasher and is actively malicious. Again, that's not exactly true in every case. Psychiatry is very complicated. But I want to make that distinction because I want it to be understood that people who convert other people into the right wing, into conservatism, and eventually neoconservatism or even fascism, I think it's a bad idea to consider them to be actively malicious. This is a societal thing. There isn't one overreaching answer. Even if it's something that does active harm, it might not be something that's intended to do active harm, and in some cases it is explicitly not something that's meant to do active harm. But regardless of whether or not it was intended to, it does. That's something else we have to understand. Alright, enough preamble out of the way, let's get into the meat of the thing. Rush Limbaugh has been talking about Feminazi since literally before I was born. And people have been listening to him talking about feminazis and immigrants and Democrats and how bad all of them are for at least that long. Something I would expect that they were banking on, Rush Limbaugh and other people like him, because of memories they had of listening to the radio in their own youths. And it worked, unfortunately for us, and it's worthwhile examining why it worked. Perhaps the most important thing to understand about this sort of conversion through repeated exposure is you have to have a reason to want to come back. And in the cases of people like Rush Limbaugh and Bill O'Reilly and Alex Jones and Sean Hannity and Michael Savage and Joseph McCarthy and Charlie Coughlin, the thing all of these people had in common was that they were entertaining. If something's fun, it's easier to get someone to repeatedly expose themselves to it. It might be a good idea to make a mental note that people still do that today. You've got your Ben Shapiro owns Antifa, Soyboy, Cucklord, Stephen Hawkins, proves black holes don't exist, and God created the universe in just 7 days. Must see! Or someone like Milo Yiannopoulos gallivanting around like he just made his first $1 million. That's not my joke, that's someone else's joke, I just can't remember whose it is. Or even here on YouTube, people like Carl Gon, or people like Andy Worski and his blood sports, or even PewDiePie's entire fucking existence. And I know that doesn't account for why people pay attention to Lobster Daddy or Stevie Molyneux, but we'll get there. Be patient. The thing is, just being entertaining isn't enough to convert someone's worldview. For them to really listen to you, you have to have a nugget of truth. And that nugget of truth, almost universally, is that your life could be better. Because it's true. That almost anyone's life could be better. Everyone wants to improve their circumstances. Everyone wants to improve their physical or mental health. We do not live in a perfect world. And it isn't just the right that takes advantage of this. Olly Smith makes an almost identical observation to this in his video about Steve Bannon, talking about a couple of fascists having a conversation about Cheddar Man. Olly also goes on to explain that this bit lends credibility to the next tactic that they use, something I'm going to call negative empowerment, for lack of a better word. I'm sure that there's another word for it, another phrase for it, but I don't know what it is offhand. These people on the right work to not empower, make people feel empowered by comparing them negatively to other groups of people. This is where you get your strapping young bucks using food stamps to buy T-bone steaks. This is where you get your bleeding heart liberals and your oppression Olympics. This is where the Jewish question comes from. Are you a feminist? Rush Limbaugh impression incoming. Surely you, a rational person, can't be a feminist. They're like Nazis. And if there's one thing we know people on the right won't accept, it's Nazis. Isn't that right, President Trump? To be clear, this isn't just othering or dehumanization, although those things are part of it. This is explicitly and deliberately making a connection in someone's mind between that person's life getting better and a group of people's lives getting worse. And yes, this is an explicitly fascist tactic, one that cunning people have known about for a great deal of time. You know that quote that certain people bring out about Lyndon B. Johnson and turning out people's pockets? Like, that quote is not an advocation of that kind of tactic, it's a condemnation of it. There was this Vice News segment not too long ago about Natalie Wynn, the woman who runs the Contrapoints channel. And she said something in that I found very interesting. She said, facts don't matter as much as people think they do. People don't believe because of facts and evidence, people believe because it's part of a story that they tell themselves. The contention I would make is that people tell themselves these stories because other people told them these stories about themselves first. And other people told them these stories about themselves because it made them easier to manipulate. I mean, the rest of it is basic separation tactics. Convince your audience that those people don't understand your needs. Convince your audience that those people are liars or criminals or con men. Convince your audience that they're being taken advantage of by the group that you're opposing. You see these things in not just cults, but most religious groups in general. Oh, that brings us back to the dull as watching paint dry pseudo-intellectual brigade. You've got your Stevie Molinoxes, you've got your Jordan P. Petersons, you've got your J.F. Garpies, I suppose. Let's just say the intellectual dark web, for simplicity's sake. The reason that conservatives and libertarians and pseudo-fascists seek out these pseudo-intellectuals is because, as entertaining as people like Rush Limbaugh or Steven Crowder or Hunter Avallone are, they aren't going to convince someone who is diametrically opposed to their worldview to adopt that worldview. They aren't even going to be able to convince someone who hasn't been seeped into it for a great deal of time. Remember, conversion is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. As entertaining as people like Rush Limbaugh and Steven Crowder and Hunter Avallone are, those entertaining people are also very straightforward with their beliefs. The intellectuals can provide a veneer of deniability, which has been part of their job throughout history. That's why you have religious people, and you have scholars, and you have heady intellectuals justifying things like the slave trade, and racism, and imperialism throughout all of history. And if you don't believe that, I would direct you to Richard Spencer's self-professed views on free speech, or Innuendo Studio's brand spankin' new pair of videos about what conservatives believe. Also, the script is too long. Can I cut it? Yeah, I'm gonna cut it in half and put the rest of it in next week's video. Editing Ron here, of course. Couple things. Apparently conditioning isn't a thing. I just kinda made it up. I guess that means I'm going to have to beat back a couple of bad faith arguments. The kind of conditioning I'm talking about isn't something as banal as deciding that you like nacho cheese Doritos, and that you don't like delicious Cooler Ranch Doritos. When I talk about conversion, I'm not just talking about changing your mind about very minor, very inconsequential things. I'm talking about an entire conversion of your worldview, usually over a very lengthy period of time. Sometimes years, sometimes decades even. It can be shorter, but those things tend not to stick as much. It's not like it is in fiction. The most accurate fictional portrayal of, like, the thing I'm talking about is actually that episode of King of the Hill where Luann joined a cult. Oh, or that one episode where Luann had the boyfriend who was like a pig furry or something, that actually touches on something really interesting, which is that people who perform those very quick conversions, what would colloquially be called brainwashing, tend to be very mentally unstable, debilitatingly mentally unstable even. And that's part of the reason that it works, at least in the sense that it works at all. It doesn't stick. Like, MKUltra was a thing. It was a thing that the US government did. I mean, they were trying to figure out how to do the thing where you brainwash someone overnight. They thought the Soviets could do it. But it didn't work. And it didn't work because the people who ran MKUltra were fucking sadists. And people tend to reject sadism and cruelty when they see it. Because, and say it with me, people are not stupid. People know when they're being fooled. People know when they're being taken advantage of, and usually they know who's doing it. I feel like I shouldn't have to keep saying that, and yet here we are. Also, this isn't just something that the right wing does. It happened to me. Like, I used to be a Republican, a Will McAvoy Republican. Does anyone remember the newsroom? Does anyone remember it being kind of shit? Anyway, like, I was a Republican in the sense that I was a Democrat who had bought into a bunch of bullshit about not being able to spend enough money to fix things, or the government being out for everyone's well-being. And perhaps more importantly, I hadn't been exposed to any other ideas until I was an adult. Again, not unlike Will McAvoy. And being exposed not just to different ideas than the ones that I grew up with, but entirely different lifestyles. Some lifestyles which the people who lived them had no choice in, completely reset my moral center. Also, it needs to be said, being on the internet was part of it too. Interacting with people who had these ideas, who understood these ideas, and wanting to understand these ideas myself, made them more familiar and made them more palatable. The thing is, this conversion I'm talking about, it's kind of like the mere exposure effect, but with societies. It isn't a forceful thing. It's a gradual thing. It's something you participate in. How is this literally not a thing? The other thing is, and this is going to be about a third of the next script, the way things are looking, I know I said in my last video that trying to change the minds of individual racists, while, it's a good thing, it's not exactly what we should be focusing on. We should be opposing systems and not people. And yet here I am, smacking down racists, saying that guy's a racist, that guy's a racist, that guy's a racist, all of you are racists. Two things. One, it's a matter of literal factual accuracy. Starvin' Stevie Molinese literally believes in the intellectual superiority of white people, by his own account. Sean Hannity has been used as an example of how white nationalist rhetoric can get into the media for almost a decade now. J.F. Garvey is literally, in scientific terms, hilariously racist, and has bad posture. These are scientific facts, they cannot be disputed. Second, and more seriously, you're going to have to challenge some people. Systems don't come out of nowhere. They're maintained by people. And if you're going to challenge those systems, you have to challenge the people who are perpetuating them. And that's actually going to be the topic of the next video. What is the system, and how do we change it? Oh God, I feel overwhelmed already. Until we get there, take care of yourselves, alright?